Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Wendy. There's been a lot of talk, I've noticed in the last 5 years, of a post-Christian America. I've seen New York Times and Washington Post articles with headlines that include post-Christian America. I think that might be a little premature. Still, a slight majority of Americans say they have some kind of association with the Christian faith. Where I come from, and indeed where our speaker comes from, Christians are indeed a minority. They are perhaps post-Christian environments. But America is asking questions of the Christian faith. Asking keen questions, intellectual questions, moral questions, power questions about this faith that has held such ground in this culture for so long. And the Questioning Christianity series is designed not so much to give pithy answers to those questions, but to publicly struggle with the questions. And if we don't have clear answers, at least point in the direction where answers might be found. And our topic tonight is indeed one of those questions. Is Christianity sexist? I think as soon as I say that, there will be people who think of the history of Christianity and think the answer is yeah. We have a fabulous speaker to address this. And I should say that given the specific content, it's probably appropriate for me to say, care for yourself during this talk. Almost necessarily, Dr. Orr-Ewing will have to talk about some striking, disturbing features of the treatment of women. I just say, look after yourself tonight. Amy Orr-Ewing received a first in theology at Oxford University. That's like getting an A, except much harder. And Oxford has been studying theology for 1,000 years, and so there's rather a lot to know. After that, Amy did her master's at King's College London before returning back to Oxford, where she did her D.Phil, is what they call PhDs in Oxford, studying the amazing public intellectual and crime writer Dorothy L. Sayers. More than that, Amy has an unusual set of experiences advocating for the Christian faith in public in amazing settings. Fancy places like the Houses of Parliament in London or the White House here in the US, but extraordinary places like in Afghanistan, commending the Christian faith to Taliban leaders. This is a woman with great experience. And she herself has struggled with this question that we bring you tonight. Will you please welcome Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing?
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for that very generous welcome, John, and thank you to everyone here at Wheaton for your amazing American wonderful hospitality, but not so much the weather. So this evening we are examining and exploring together this question: is Christianity sexist? Now, I think if we were to take a poll on the streets of the city near where I live and ask, is Christianity sexist? Overwhelmingly, the answer would be yes. Christianity is seen as intolerant, patriarchal, a tool of oppressors. My friend Jo Vitale recently reminded me in her podcast that in 2015, BBC Radio 4 ran a series of radio shows called the Misogyny Book Club. And these radio programmes explored the books that have most stoked misogyny in the English-speaking world. I listened at the time to those broadcasts with interest, and I went back again as I was preparing this lecture to listen to them. Here are the books that were examined as significant in fueling misogyny in the English-speaking world and that were then discussed as radio programmes, and they included Shakespeare's play Hamlet, and focusing in on his attitude to women's sexuality and their licence to speak. D.H. Lawrence, Sons and Lovers. Perhaps unsurprisingly, 50 Shades of Grey. But guess which book got the #1 spot? Well, you guessed it, the Bible, and in particular, the book of Genesis. And that really struck me, because in my experience, Christians often root their convictions about the value of every human life in the idea that all human beings are made in the image of God, whether they believe in him or not, and as a consequence of being image bearers, all human beings deserve to be treated with dignity. Now, this idea is explored in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, and in the first chapter, in verse 27. So God created humanity in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This ancient text from the ancient Near East speaks of male and female as image bearers of God. You see, the Christian faith is not a survival of the fittest worldview, where the elimination of the weak by the strong is accepted. After all, this evening, we could ask ourselves the question, why not be sexist? Why not dominate or subjugate other human beings if that works out well for you? It is the Bible that tells me that all human life has a transcendent source, and thus it matters how people, male and female, are treated. And the Bible also warns me that I will be held to account for how I have lived. My actions and my decisions in history have a relevance in eternity. Now, in the context of women today in the world, this question is life and death. I've just been involved in a plan to help women who were captured as part of the Chibok girls by Boko Haram in northern Nigeria a number of years ago, where they were abducted as schoolgirls and forcibly married to Boko Haram fighters and now have children. I've just been involved in seeing some of those women liberated, set free. Around the world, this question of misogyny and sexism is live, and well, it's life and death. But our current situation for women in the West is also quite concerning. Let me draw your attention to two phenomena we face as women in the West. Number one, objectification. That could be construing an individual as an object, leading to women being perceived, when objectified, as less competent and, by virtue of becoming an object, as less human, writes one scholar. Women are assessed by physical attributes as sexual objects on a comprehensive scale. And one study found that women, when objectified by a focus on their sexual features or functions, sexual objectification, they were perceived as lacking uniquely human attributes. They were seen as animals. It's called animalistic dehumanization. And conversely, when women were objectified by an emphasis on their beauty or physical appearance, appearance-focused objectification, they were perceived as lacking human nature, mechanistic dehumanization. The scholars wrote, in study 3, we also examined an outcome associated with women's risk of harm and found that mechanistic dehumanization in response to appearance-focused objectification uniquely promoted the perception that a woman was less capable of feeling pain. That is in the Western world that you and I live in, where if you're a man here tonight, thank you for coming. Where your daughter, your wife, your mother, your sister will experience this reality. So that's objectification. Then secondly, sexual violence. In the USA, according to the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, sexual violence is sexual activity when consent is not obtained or freely given. And it's a serious public health problem in the United States. Sexual health violence affects millions of people each year in the US. And researchers know the numbers underestimate the problem because so many cases go unreported. Survivors may be ashamed or embarrassed or afraid to tell the police, friends or family about the violence that they have experienced. Sexual violence is common. Over half of women have experienced sexual violence involving physical contact during their lifetimes. This is according to the Centre for Disease Control in the US. 1 in 4 women have experienced completed or attempted rape, and 1 in 3 women have experienced sexual harassment in a public place. And those statistics are very similar in Britain. I want to suggest to you this evening that a philosophy that challenged the reality, the felt reality of women, of objectification and violence, by proclaiming the full and equal humanity of women as dignified creatures, created, valued, sacred, and made in the image of God, that would be profoundly good news, and it would have an impact on our culture if it were to be believed. But hold on, I hear you say, can we possibly hold the church up as any example at all in this regard? Surely we can't have an evening like this, considering this question, without being honest about the history and present reality within the church. Let me just suggest a few areas in which Christianity has been sexist in practice. Firstly, the idea of restrictive roles or spheres of life that are open to women, with other roles and spheres of life being closed to them. Whether in the church or home or in society at large, at different times, Christians have been seen as seeking to restrict women in quite a patchy picture by limiting them to spheres. In my own university at Oxford, it was only in 1920 that women were allowed to have a degree conferred on them. Before that, they went to university, they took all the same exams as the men, but they were not allowed to have the degree. As one of the beneficiaries of belonging to the first cohort of women to graduate from Oxford, Dorothy L. Sayers, who John mentioned earlier, called to mind the pioneers of university training for women, who demanded that women should be admitted and be allowed to have the degree. And they found that the question was repeatedly posed to them, why should women want to know about Aristotle? And Sayers found that her appeal was not to a feminist narrative of female equality or even superiority over men, but a direct assertion of the female humanity and individuality of a person, and the determination to avoid reductionism by viewing a person through the physiological elements of their biological sex. She said the answer is not that all women would be better for knowing about Aristotle, but simply what women want as a class is irrelevant. I want to know about Aristotle. It is true that most women care nothing about him at all, but I, eccentric individual that I am, do want to know about Aristotle, and I submit there is nothing in my shape or bodily functions which need prevent me knowing about him. Women have been restricted to spheres, and sometimes the church has had the megaphone and the loudest voice calling for that. Secondly, women have been seen as seducers to be feared. Women have often been scapegoated and blamed for the sexual violence they then experience. the classic, her skirt was too short, or it was her fault for looking too alluring, or being in the wrong place, why was she out so late? And some people see that kind of scapegoating as originating in the Genesis story of Adam and Eve. I was once on a BBC radio show debating with an academic, and this question came up, and she was absolutely determined to get this point across, that the origin story of the scapegoat woman is Eve being blamed for the evils of the world. I did try to point out that in the Genesis narrative, unlike equivalent narratives of the time, actually uniquely, the Bible affirms the humanity of that woman Eve in giving her the capacity of volition at all. The woman has choice. The woman exercises choice. Yes, things go horribly wrong, but actually the Bible upholds this view of the humanity, equal humanity of women. How else has Christianity been bad news for women? Well, thirdly, women were for a long time denied the vote, sometimes on the basis of Christians arguing for male headship, not just in the church, but also in the home. So there's one set of sort of propaganda arguing against women's suffrage in Britain, and these are the slogans. Women and men have separate spheres. Most women don't want the vote. Women's role is in local affairs. Women are already represented by their husbands. It's dangerous to change a system that works. Women don't fight to defend their country. They shouldn't be allowed to vote. And the church engaged in some of that sloganeering in my country. But the suffragist and movement worker for women's votes in Britain noted in her autobiography, 1935, she's called Helena Swanwick, and her autobiography is called I Have Been Young. She said, "Let there be no mistake about it. This movement, the movement to advocate for women's votes, was not primarily political. It was social, moral, psychological, and profoundly religious." So in a lot of these examples, we're going to see, yes, there were Christians and representatives of ecclesiastical authority restricting women in different ways. But yes, there were also Christians advocating for that Genesis 1:27 view of women. Now, we could give a lot more examples of how the church has done really badly with sexism. We could talk about divorce rights or property ownership, or the suppression of violence against women in the name of submission, or the cover-up of the rape and abuse of women and children by the church in the name of protecting the institution. And I think this evening, if we're going to be honest, and we were to look at all of that and ask this question, is Christianity sexist? We would have to say, at least sometimes, the answer has been and is yes. This is a wrestle, this question, and as John said tonight, we're not offering easy answers. We are going to contend for some answers this evening, though. Now, if we address this question just purely on a personal basis of our own experience, some of us are going to say, no, the church, Christianity isn't sexist. It hasn't been in my experience. I've had a wonderful, liberating experience of Christian community. And others are going to say, no, I've had a terrible experience. So I want to suggest that our own personal experience probably isn't the best way to settle this question. For me, the most important question is this: does the Christian worldview itself, and does the teaching of Jesus and the life of Jesus, does it warrant the sexist behaviour perpetrated by those who call themselves Christians? And then secondly, does the Christian faith and worldview actually have something positive to say to a culture that does objectify women and subject women to such high levels of violence? Is there a coherent intellectual basis for the dignity and humanity of women as well as men. And I want to suggest that this evening, as we struggle with these questions, we need to be honest about the realities perpetrated by some Christians at some times. But we need to ask ourselves, are those things a legitimate outworking of the Christian faith, and do they reflect the person of Christ? And to do that, we would need to go back to the source material, the scriptures, and ask whether our experiences are warranted by these texts. So let's begin to consider together the Old Testament. The Bible, of course, is written over a long period of time into specific cultures, and it's written as an unfolding revelation. And many of these contexts did not give equal social advantages to women and men. It is also true to say that the Old Testament accounts include detailed tellings of stories that include rape, polygamy, incest, female oppression, and violence against women. And for some, on first reading of the Old Testament, that is enough to conclude this book is oppressive and sexist. But I think we need to dig a little bit deeper and ask a question. Why might those accounts of rape and incest and polygamy and female oppression and violence, why might they have been included? Why retell these kinds of events that have been so extraordinarily distressing for the individuals involved? Is this game, set and match to the verdict of horrific sexism at the Bible's door? Now, when we read ancient texts, we need to read them carefully, taking account of the cultural context and the world history and the culture that we find around the text. One passage labelled a text of terror by many is from the book of Judges. And it describes the story of an Israelite man from the tribe of Levi who attempts to save himself from a mob of violent Israelite males who are surrounding the house that he is staying in. And they are from a different tribe than he is from. And in order to save himself, he throws his concubine out to them. Now, concubine was someone he was in a sexual relationship with, but he was not married to. So there's already a power imbalance there and a level of oppression there. The woman is gang raped by the men and left for dead. And the man, on opening the door and finding her body the next morning, goes on to commit a grotesque act. He dismembers her body and sends it out to the different tribes of his country of Israel, calling for vengeance in a battle rather than taking any responsibility himself. A battle ensues so that there's more violence, and the man who threw her to the wolves is never held accountable. What a horrible story. Why is a story like that in the Bible? As we begin to look and see, it becomes clear that this story is written as a judgment of people who have turned so far away from what God has said, and they've begun to do evil, but what is right in their own eyes. Pete Williams, a scholar at Tyndale House in Cambridge, notes that the inclusion of this text and others like it demonstrates that the suffering of women is not unseen and it is not unheard. Even though the rapists and the Levite man who degrade this woman and the wider people in their violent response, even though they do not value this woman's story is worthy of being written down, of being heard, of being remembered. She is seen. Her story, her suffering are significant to God, who is the judge of all. And we are called upon by texts like this to see evil and not turn away. including the evil done to women. In the Old Testament, there are numerous positive images of women. Eve, who I've already mentioned, is described in the book of Genesis as Adam's helper. I don't know how many of you in this room think that's a positive image, or what the visual image that pops into your head when you hear that word. Eve is made to be Adam's helper. The visual image that pops into my head is a woman doing washing up with bubbles up to her elbows with an apron on. You know, we perhaps don't see that as a very positive image. In fact, the Hebrew word there, Ezer, translated as helper, to describe Eve, is almost always, in the rest of the Old Testament, used with reference to God's relationship to human beings. Eve is Adam's Ezer. God is humanity's Ezer. In reference to God, the word Ezer is translated deliverer or saviour. Interestingly, it is to a woman, Eve, that the first redemptive promise of the Bible comes. The first messianic promise comes that through her seed, one will be born who will bruise the serpent's head. It is through a woman that one will be born into the world who will have the power to utterly crush and defeat evil. It is a woman who had been mistreated by the father of the faith, Abraham, and his wife, Sarah. A woman who was in a coercive relationship with this couple is coerced into surrogacy of sorts. She bears this Abraham's child, Ishmael, and then she is beaten and thrown out of the home, and she flees into the desert, flees for her life with her child. And the angel of the Lord appears to her, and she is the first person in the Bible to name the God of the Old Testament, and she calls him El Roi, the God who sees. The primary teaching text of the Old Testament describing a female role model doesn't conform with our stereotype of a good Christian woman. Perhaps one who wears sandals and a rainbow guitar strap. Proverbs 31 says that this woman lacks nothing of value. She assesses and buys and sells property. She's entrepreneurial. She employs multiple people. She works hard. She provides well for her employees. She plants a vineyard. That means she thinks strategically. She plans ahead and then implements strategy. She studies as a scholar. She teaches others. She embraces the intellectual life. She cares for and provides for the poor. She commands the respect of influential people. She's loved by her family. She has really good taste in home furnishings and fashion. She's able to laugh at the future. This scripture even says this woman has good arms. She doesn't have bingo wings. She's got great arms. She's able to laugh at the future rather than fearing it. And she's respected at the gate. That's the ideal woman in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, women were called sometimes prophetesses. At other times, women were given the role of enacting God's justice. Deborah, the judge, is appointed quite a few thousand years before we had a female judge sitting on a bench in Britain. Deborah is appointed as a judge for a whole nation and rules over Israel, enjoying then 40 years of peace. In prayer, women and men in the Old Testament are equal. The covenant women of the Old Testament do not require the priestly mediation of their husband or their father. They pray directly to God. Women in the Old Testament challenge kings with their spiritual authority, lead out in worship like Miriam, pray to God directly, and find that their sufferings are empathized with and not skirted over, not despised, not forgotten. Their stories matter. And that is so unlike other equivalent texts of the time. Perhaps even more fascinatingly, the image of that female imagery is used to depict what the God of the Old Testament is like. In Isaiah chapter 42, God draws an analogy between himself and a warrior. and then between himself and a woman giving birth. Having given birth to twins, I can see an analogy between a warrior and a woman giving birth. This is interesting graphic language to describe God through the mouth of a prophet. And of course, Isaiah chapter 66, verse 13. As a mother comforts her child, so will I comfort you. The God of the Old Testament does not regard female imagery about himself as degrading in any way. Male and female, he created them in his image. Is the Bible sexist? I think there's a case that can be made of a really positive, counter to our culture view of male and female originating in Scripture. In the New Testament, there are a number of events involving women. And it's really important for us to understand the culturally conservative attitudes of the context into which the Gospels are written. And this context is open to our view by a small telling little statement in the Gospel of John. Jesus is about to have, or is having, a famous encounter with a woman at a well in chapter 4. But there's a very interesting telling little phrase in verse 27, which shows the context of the time, because the disciples come back and they come across Jesus doing something astonishing. The text says his disciples returned and were amazed to find Jesus. Insert the blank. What was Jesus doing? Standing on his head? Raising someone from the dead? Doing something absolutely surprising and amazing? They were surprised to find him talking with a woman. That's the context that Jesus' ministry occurs within. And what does he do in that context? Well, firstly, we see that he had female disciples. In a culture where the idea of women travelling around with a group of men or having the status of disciple was seriously questioned, Jesus had a number of women who were included in his travelling circle. Luke's Gospel, chapter 8, verses 1 to 3, names some of them. The 12 male disciples were with him, and also some women who'd been cured of evil spirits and diseases, Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had come out, Joanna, the wife of Chuza, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. Not only were women included as disciples in the travelling community of Jesus, they also paid for everything. Now, there's a sharp contrast here with authors like Ben Sirach of Jerusalem from around 195 BC, who reflects a more prevalent attitude of the time. He says this: bad temper, insolence, and shame hold sway where the wife supports the husband. Jesus travels with women in his group of disciples and allows them to contribute financially to the needs of the group. Another example we see in Matthew chapter 12, when Jesus is told his mother and brothers are waiting outside to see him. The text says he pointed at his disciples and he says, "Here are my mother and brothers." In the Middle Eastern culture of the first century, it would be unspeakably offensive to point to an exclusively male group and use female imagery to describe any of them. That group included women. We also see, secondly, so Jesus had female disciples. Secondly, Jesus taught women in the New Testament. And perhaps we're used to this idea. But in Luke chapter 10, verse 38, we read of a woman called Mary who sat at the feet of Jesus while her sister Martha was distracted with much serving. And she asks her sister Mary to come and help her. But Mary continues to engage in theological study, and her sister is very annoyed. Now, in first century Judaism, rabbis often gathered groups of students or disciples who would sit at his feet to learn the Torah, the Old Testament. And that privilege of sitting at the feet of the rabbi was strictly for men only. It actually remained so until quite recently. Men studied the Torah and women did the kind of practical work in the house. So Mary, by sitting at the feet of Jesus to listen to his word, is assuming the role of a rabbinical student, a role reserved in Judaism exclusively for men. Martha's objection to Mary isn't just that she needs practical help. She's objecting that Mary has no business assuming a man's role and neglecting the woman's role. And that is why Jesus' words are so powerful when he says, "One thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part, and it shall not be taken from her." Jesus is saying that the Jewish restrictions on the roles of women will not prevent him from teaching Mary. The clear implication here is that Mary is affirmed as worthy of a rabbi's theological instruction. And it's interesting that later on in the Gospels, and in John's Gospel in particular, we meet Martha again, Mary's sister. And this time, she is the one who is taught theology. In fact, Jesus reveals to Martha in a one-to-one conversation with no man there to listen or learn it with her, he reveals to her one of the most astonishing theological statements of the New Testament. He says to Martha, a woman, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies." In contrast to the cultural norms of the time, Jesus seems to make a habit of revealing great theological truths to women. The first person in John's Gospel to discover Jesus' true identity is that Samaritan woman at the well. And Jesus taught, as she says, "I know that the Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he'll explain everything to us." And Jesus declares, "I who speak to you am he." Jesus isn't just countercultural in having female disciples and teaching women. He also behaves towards women and speaks about women in a countercultural way. His parables are drawn from the life experience of both men and women. For example, he has a parable about the mending of a garment. That's an everyday image from the average female vocation. And he couples it with the parable of the making of the wine, an everyday image from an average male working day. But Jesus goes further than that in his teaching. He actually portrays God using female imagery. In Luke 15, Jesus follows a parable about a shepherd searching for a lost sheep. He says, God is like a shepherd, and we're like the lost sheep, and he's searching for us. And then at the end of Luke 15, he tells a parable about a father and a prodigal son. And God is like the running father who goes out to meet and find the prodigal son. Between those two parables is another parable about a woman down on her hands and knees, searching through her house for a lost coin. God is like a shepherd looking for a sheep. God is like a father running for his lost son. God is like a woman searching for a lost coin. Following on from all of this, and I think most importantly, we see that women played an important and prominent role as the historic witnesses to the central events surrounding the person Jesus Christ. A teenage girl called Mary is the only witness to the Annunciation of the virgin birth, and she stands as the primary witness to what Christians call the doctrine of the incarnation, the idea that God is born in human history as a person. The primary witness to that is a woman called Mary. It's a group of women the four gospel accounts tell us, who stood at the foot of the cross, watching Jesus die and hearing his last words. The only male disciple who did not desert Jesus and who is mentioned is John. But prominent in all the accounts, standing close, are the women witnessing the crucifixion of Jesus. And strikingly, it's a group of women who first witnessed the empty tomb, the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I think this is particularly striking for us to remember if we're of a skeptical bent and perhaps we're, not followers of Jesus, we don't necessarily believe in all this God stuff. It would be important to remember that in the ancient world, the word of a woman was perceived as having far less value than that of a man. In fact, a woman's testimony was worth very, very little in a court of law. So if you were going to make up a story about God being born in history, dying by crucifixion, and then rising from the dead and conquering death, you would never position women as the primary witnesses if you were trying to get people to believe it actually happened. So this is seen as actually strong evidence for the veracity of the gospel accounts. It's unconscionable that someone in the ancient world fabricating a historical event would position female witnesses in the way the Gospels do. But the Gospels do. This is what Dorothy L. Sayers wrote about Jesus. She said, Jesus met lots of women, so he did give us a direct line on them. And the most remarkable thing, though no one seems to have noticed it, is that alone among teachers and founders of religion, he did and said nothing special about them. He never said they were tempters or snares or weaklings or imbeciles or inspirations or angels. You could read the whole gospel from end to end without learning from it that there was anything peculiar about women, or that mankind was divided into two sections, the one consisting of complete human beings with certain sexual functions, and the other of perambulating sex organs with a distant resemblance to humanity. She went on in her famous essay to the church, Are Women Human? She said, perhaps it is no wonder that women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man, and there never has been such another. A prophet and teacher who never nagged at them, never flattered or coaxed or patronised, who never made arch jokes about them, never treated them as the women, God help us, or the ladies, God bless them, who rebuked without querulousness and praised without condescension, who took their questions and arguments seriously. So my question tonight, as we honestly grapple with this question, is Christianity sexist, is what will you do with the testimony and witness of the women who have passed on to us the true story of the incarnation of God in history in the person of Jesus Christ, who've told us and testified and witnessed to the details of his death by crucifixion, and who've witnessed to the fact of his empty tomb, his resurrection from the dead? What will you do with their witness? And in our context, in the Western world, where women are often objectified as objects, increasingly pursued as targets of violence and sexual aggression, where the very humanity of women is what is at stake, it is into precisely this question that Christ speaks, upholding the Genesis ideal of male and female, created in the image of God. Human life is sacred and precious because it has a transcendent value in male and female, and enacted by Christ in his treatment of women. So as we come into land, we can see with our own eyes that religion has been patriarchal, that Christians have been sexist. But if we ask ourselves, is violence or patriarchy or sexism a logical outworking of the worldview? I think we'll come to a different conclusion. Jesus was radically countercultural in his positive treatment of women. And we see that Christianity in the early church actually reflected that really beautifully. In fact, Christianity eventually turned upside down how the Roman Empire viewed women. In the ancient world, women were objects and possessions. Their voices and opinions didn't matter. Girl babies were often left to die because the family wanted a boy. And they sometimes died or were found and taken as slaves, often to sexual slavery. Instead of being the lowest of status and vulnerable to infanticide or sexual slavery, as the empire viewed them, women in Christianity were seen as having equal humanity with men. Women in the New Testament are welcomed, taught, spoken of as equally human. Women are honoured as witnesses to the primary facts of the Christian story, the incarnation, the atonement, the resurrection. Women in the early church played significant roles in the biblical literature, teaching and prophesying and witnessing and providing and leading. And women in the early church went to their deaths in the amphitheatre, martyred alongside Christian men, and their deaths were recorded, like the first woman martyr that we know of, called Perpetua, a noble Christian woman born in Carthage in 181 AD. The Apostle Paul wrote in his letter to the Galatians, "There is no Jew, no Greek, no slave nor free, male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus." And that vision changed the Roman world and ultimately shaped our society too. I suggest to you this evening that sexism and the oppression of women is not a logical outworking of the teachings of Jesus, which is why Christians in every generation have resisted it, although we haven't always done the best of jobs. I also want to suggest to you, though, that truth matters and ideas have consequences. And if male and female are equal image bearers of the divine image, and that underpins the sacredness of human life, the outworking of that will be practical. And it will look different from a worldview that tells us that human beings are just slime on the face of a rock, here by chance through a process of the strong eliminating the weak. A worldview in which there's no moral or philosophical reason to be overly concerned about domination or subjugation. We just need to make sure we're not on the receiving end of it. If the specifics of life are directly impacted by our foundational beliefs, then male and female, equally reflecting the image of God in their shared humanity, would be powerful and beautiful in our day. And it would run directly counter to a reductionist view of women, a separate class economically reduced to a sphere dependent on men, or viewed through a lens of objectification. The Christian claim is that a divine pattern for humanity, male and female, equally human, reflecting the image of God, is upheld in the person and ministry of Jesus. And where the church has failed women, Christ, as the truth incarnate, is the perfect pattern for us to follow and see. Now, we need to be honest that sometimes we're going to be disappointed by Christianity. After all, as my friend the scholar, Dr. Elaine Storkey, puts it, the church recruits from the human race. We shouldn't be surprised to be disappointed by Christianity. But I want to suggest this evening that we will not be disappointed by Christ. The promise of Christ is that coming to know him really matters, and it really makes a difference. One of the most eloquent atheists in Britain is a columnist for The Times. He's called Matthew Paris, and he grew up in Africa and then came to the UK and back to the UK with his parents as a young person. And this is what he wrote. He said, "Now, as a confirmed atheist, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa. And it is sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, government projects, and international aid efforts." He writes, "These alone will not do. Education and training alone will not do." His observation is that Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. He says the rebirth is real, the change is good. He goes on, "I used to avoid this truth by applauding as you can the practical work of mission churches in Africa. It's a pity, I would say, that salvation is part of the package, but Christians, black and white, working in Africa do heal the sick, do teach people to read and write, and only the severest kind of secularist could see a mission hospital or school and say, the world would be better without it. I would allow if faith was needed to motivate the missionaries to help, then fine, but what counted was the help, not the faith. But this doesn't fit the facts," he writes. "Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings a spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good." I would want to change one word in that. It's Jesus Christ that changes hearts. The change is real. The rebirth is good. And if we look to him and follow him around this question of sexism and patriarchy and oppression in our world, we will not be disappointed in what we find. Is Christianity sexist? Not if you look at Jesus Christ. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Amy. We'll just do a little bit of a stage change. It wouldn't be a lecture series titled Questioning Christianity if we didn't allow you to question Christianity, or at least our representative of Christianity here tonight. And the way we're going to do it is you'll see two microphones in the aisles. Please just make your way there. You could queue up if there are many, many questions. But please do that and then offer your question. Try and offer it as clearly, succinctly as you can. But let me just say, any question is allowed. And if it's some kind of critique, I guess that's especially allowed. I'll kick us off while you maybe make your way to the microphones. I mean, in some ways, your argument is Christianity in its kind of pure form, it's Christianity in a vacuum, is great for women. The problem is that the church hasn't done that with any consistency. So I guess people might be wondering, does that not suggest Christianity lacks power, has great ideas, but doesn't actually work itself out?
Thank you, John. I think that's a really powerful critique, honestly, although I did try to argue that certainly the early church actually completely upended the sexism of the Roman world and did live it out very practically. And there have certainly been many seasons and eras of the church where we have said that, seen that reality lived out. And I think this is one of the issues for the Christian faith, is that we're hopefully very honest that all it takes to become a Christian is to be a person who acknowledges our need of forgiveness and accepts the forgiveness that Christ offers. And then there's a long process of sanctification and transformation that happens. But inevitably, a community of Christians is a community of people who recognise their own failure. And so that's a great strength on one level, but in an area like this, where we can go through seasons and kind of cultural waves sweep through, which take us away from Christ, take us away from the impetus of the scriptures, it's also an issue. We are fallible, the church is fallible. And that's why I think the heart of the Christian faith is Christ. You know, someone famously said, you know, you can't have Christianity, or you can't be Christian without Christ. You know, if you take Christ out of Christian, you're left with IAN, and Ian can't help you, you know? It's like, it's all about Christ. He's the centre. And, yeah, so that's what I'd say.
With apologies to any Ians here tonight. We'll take a first question there. Thank you very much.
Hi, first of all, I wanted to thank you so much for coming and speaking to us this evening. I wanted to ask, what would your response be to someone who asserts that Christianity is sexist, and then points to the person of Paul and his letters, in which he talks a lot about women wearing head coverings and remaining silent in church?
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you asked that, honestly, that I'm not joking. I actually had a section on some of the New Testament after the Gospels, but saw the time and cut it. So you may have noticed me have a bit of a delay there. So actually what's really interesting to me is that in the New Testament we see this pattern of how Jesus treated women kind of continue. So we see women as teachers of theology, affirmed by Paul. You know, Priscilla and Aquila together teach somebody called Apollos, and Luke records it in Acts, and Paul's very aware of that and fine with it. We also have a woman presented as a deacon of the church, but using the male form of the word deacon in Romans chapter 16, a woman called Phoebe. And it's really interesting, the Greek word used to describe how Phoebe operates in the Roman church, and the word is that she is prostatis, and that Greek word elsewhere is kind of used for like the leader or president of a temple, so it's clearly very affirming of Phoebe's role in the Roman church. We're introduced to Philip, who had 4 daughters who prophesied, so who are, you know, articulate and eloquent in public worship in some way, inspired by the Holy Spirit. There's some argument over the name or the word junior, whether that's a male or female person that Paul describes as outstanding amongst the apostles, but scholars will point to the fact that there are multiple references to junior as a female name and almost none to junius as a male name elsewhere in Greek literature. So whatever we make of, I think, the 2 significant passages you're probably thinking about, which are 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2, 1 Corinthians 14 speaking about male headship, and 1 Timothy 2 talking about a woman being silent in the church and not having authority over men. However we understand those 2 specific passages, they need to be read, as with everything else in the Bible, in the context of the rest of the New Testament. So to present Paul as someone who is sexist and against women, I think would be to be completely unfair. We're all one in Christ Jesus, no male, no female. Go for it, Phoebe. Go for it, Junior. Go for it, Priscilla. Even the context with Lydia, where they meet and she asks, can the church meet in my house? You know, that's a profound question, because often the first convert in a city and the place where the church met, in the oikos, in the house, that person had a leadership role of sorts. So Lydia's asking that, well, you know, what can happen here? And, you know, Paul is not rejecting her. There's a warmth towards women. Now, different people, and probably John and I might even differ on how you interpret 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy 2. But I think however you do interpret them, it's important that you see them within the rest of the New Testament. So it may be that So my sense of I would sit within the kind of egalitarian understanding of the New Testament and understand the word kephali, head, to be talking about a bit like the head of a river, the source of a river. So it's not talking about hierarchical relationship, because also in that passage you have Christ and God mentioned, and the man and the woman. And it's more talking about source and origin and interrelatedness. And then with 1 Timothy 2, my understanding of that would be that we need to be very careful about the surrounding text, because Paul goes on to say that the woman sinned first, Eve sinned first, and women will be saved, justified through childbearing. So everywhere else he says we're justified by faith, and in this one place we have this idea of justification by childbirth. So clearly there's something going on that's interesting and maybe a bit different, and the context in the Ephesian church where Timothy lived was that the worship of the goddess Artemis dominated the city, so the church would have been filled with people who came from a background of that worship. And that involved women dominating men. And those would be women who didn't know the Genesis story of Adam and Eve, and who would need to be taught that. So Paul wants those women to learn in quietness. They still need to learn. They need to study and be taught. So my understanding of that particular text is that it doesn't cancel out the other areas where Paul is very positive about women's voices being used and exercised in the church. Now, some will have a different view and view that 1 Timothy 2 passage as speaking about all women in all churches for all time. And what I think I would like to affirm for brothers and sisters who hold that position is that you can hold that position and not be misogynist. You can hold that position and that not be a sexist category, because you're seeking to live in obedience to Christ and what you understand his word to be. And it's not about reducing women to be less than men. It would be about how a church is ordered. So that would be my sort of very short answer to a massive question. I'm sure you have courses on this here. But my heart would be to communicate that overwhelmingly the New Testament is radically positive about women and not sexist, including Paul.
Indeed. And for the purposes of tonight, I agree with everything Amy says. The question over here, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to ask about biblical interpretation specifically. So when we interpret the Bible, they often say that the Bible is literature and you should interpret it as literature. And when you interpret literature, you're supposed to think about the original audience and like what the author intended. And when I do this with the Bible, especially with the Old Testament and specifically wisdom literature, I notice that many parts of the Bible are actually explicitly addressed towards men, and most kind of seem to assume that they're talking to men. And in fact, the most famous passage of like advice for women, Proverbs 31, which you mentioned, it's actually framed as advice on what type of wife you should seek, because it's assuming that the listener is a man. And I was just kind of wondering how I, as a woman, should think about that as I interpret the Bible for myself and for my own life.
Thank you. What a thoughtful and interesting question. Thank you for that. I mean, I think that's a huge area which I can't do justice to it tonight, but let me offer one thought, which is that within the New Testament, the church is envisaged as the bride of Jesus. Eternity is envisaged as the wedding supper of the Lamb, where God marries us. And the church, the imagery of the church is overwhelmingly female. So I don't think the Bible positions it all one way. Having said that, of course, we understand that Scripture is a sort of unfolding revelation, and the context of the ancient Near East is overwhelmingly patriarchal, and so it will be true that there is this kind of dominant use of male language. But it does seem to me that the New Testament kind of is quite radical in saying, when you become a Christian, women, you're a son because you're an heir. And that's how the ancient world understood being an heir. So I'm very happy to sing choruses and hymns where I'm a son, because it's about adoption as an heir. But men, you're the bride. So if you can live with that, we can live with being the son. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I don't know if you want to add to that, John.
Well, it just occurs to me that in the New Testament, at least Philippians, 1 Corinthians, Colossians, Ephesians, explicitly name women, address them directly. So they are hearers. This is literature designed for women to hear in that immediate moment. Yeah. And that's the context in which Christians read the Old Testament as well.
Yeah.
So women are explicitly in the audience. If you take a canonical perspective, that is, read the Old Testament through to the New Testament, it's clearly men and women together. Over here, thank you.
Thank you so very much, truly, for sharing with us tonight. I think our culture needs it, and I wish I had invited more men to join us. Given your involvement with the apologetics and the Akka in regards to the Adam was born first, Eve second, Adam from the dust, Eve from his rib, written perhaps by Moses, how do we respond to this kind of male-dominated we were first logic?
Thank you. So I mentioned earlier that I have twins. And one of the jokes when you have twins is that everyone asks who was born first. And that idea of the first being primary is very dominant, isn't it, in our mindset? And it was wonderful the first time they were in East Africa to meet a leader in East Africa who said to the second-born, "You're the leader." In our culture, when there are twins, the leader kicks the one out first, you go and check, and then comes out afterwards. So the dominant one comes second. And that struck me as really, really interesting. Like, there are two ways of seeing it, aren't there? Men are made from dirt, and we're made from a rib. I don't feel too worried about that. But in all seriousness, of course, you know, that has been taken to assert male dominance, but I don't think the text allows for that. Genesis 1:27 that I've really gone on about a lot tonight. Extraordinary in the era in which Genesis was written to say male and female. Right there at the beginning of the Bible, created in the image of God. Extraordinary to call woman Isa, a name given to God, prophetic of the role that a woman would have in giving birth to the Messiah, of course. So, yeah, other than that, I'm not sure what to say, but hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you. Question over here, thank you.
All right, thank you so much for being here. The lecture was fascinating, and I'm so glad I got to come. You mentioned Judges 19 in your talk, and that brought to mind Genesis 19. It's almost a direct parallel, where Lot offers up his daughters to the men of Sodom so that the angels, his guests, won't have to get hurt. But the only reason his daughters don't get raped is because the angels stop him. And as you discussed, just the fact that these stories of like women's abuse are in the Bible is very important. But some of these same men that would have let abuse happen or did let abuse happen are held up as righteous elsewhere in the Bible. I'm thinking of Lot in 2 Peter. And for me, as a woman, reading that Lot is righteous, there's just a dissonance in my mind. And I've never been able to have any respect for Lot. So I'm wondering what you would say to that, and like, how does that make sense?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that's a really, really important question. And I mean, other people feel the same about King David. I mean, yeah. So I think this is a really, really difficult area and a really deep and thoughtful question again. So thank you for raising it. So the first thing I think I would want to reiterate is that the text around that incident does not approve of that behaviour and that incident, and the very recording of the suffering of women is profound. And I actually think that in our cultural moment post-Me Too, we have a new understanding of what it means to an abuse victim of rape, or survivor, better word, to be believed and for their story to be known and told. Is a powerful thing in and of itself. The only answer I can begin to get to on this is, how could someone who had perpetrated such harm be regarded or named as righteous? Could it be that their whole life isn't defined by that one instance, and this also is a picture of grace? So it is possible that we can do terrible things that we regret. And of course, in the Old Testament, though, people of faith are looking forwards towards the cross for redemption and forgiveness. And by faith, Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. But he's still actually saved through the cross, working backwards in history as well as forwards to us. And so that's the way I would seek to reconcile it in my mind, that it is not, the text is, the Lot text in particular is not condoning Lot's behaviour, but that incident is not the only defining thing about his life. And the possibility of grace, even for those who have sinned heinously, is real. But of course, as we know, and I think I mentioned in one of the chapels, that grace is possible through repentance, and repentance never involves a minimizing of harm. And in our Western church, I feel that's a message we need to recapture. Not cheap grace, very costly grace through the death of the Son of God in history.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question of that.
Yeah, thank you so much for your lecture. I'm curious about the social extension of the claim that Christianity isn't sexist because of the person of Christ. I think a lot of times the question is asked with a broader understanding of how we create a more just and equitable society for women. So my question is, do you think a Christian worldview and a commitment to the biblical understanding of Jesus is necessary to form a more just and equitable society? Or could these equal conclusions come from other ethical systems or frameworks of worldviews?
Thank you. That's a really thoughtful question as well. I love that question. I wouldn't want to be so arrogant to say as it would be impossible without the Christian worldview for such a system to occur. But I think I would question what the basis for it would be. So if life doesn't have a transcendent source and we just have a materialistic understanding of origin, and all we are is the stuff, the matter of our bodies, here through a process of the survival of the fittest, or however we understand, however we understand evolution, whatever, what can account for an ethic that uplifts the weak and protects the physiologically weaker? So if a male is able to overpower a female, why not? Particularly if you're seeking to have what you want in life, or you're seeking to propagate your own DNA. So I'm not saying that people who live with a materialist framework do that. I'm not saying they can't have a moral system. The question is there an adequate ontological basis for that moral system? And I think theists would argue that God actually provides the best moral frame, the best ontological undergirding. It actually, belief in God warrants honouring the image of God in people. And so it ought to be helpful in creating that society. And then just a third thing I would say is that scholars like Tom Holland, the historian, I don't know if any of you've read him. Oh, we've got a whoop for Tom. I'm interviewing him next year in a few months in London, which I'm really excited about. Lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah. So Tom Holland talks about how in the Western world, we're far more Christian than we know. So we're living with the fruits of a Christian worldview. And we can't necessarily account for those things without God, even as we reject God. Os Guinness talks about it as the cut flower civilization. And, you know, you cut the flower from the root and it can live in the vase of water for a while, but eventually the flowers begin to wilt. And that may be what we're seeing in our cultural moment as we're cut from the root of the Christian faith. So, thank you.
Thank you. I see we have 3 more people at the microphone. That's probably going to do us, given the hour. I feel like just adding that there's a clip going around right at the moment. Yuval Noah Harari, an amazing video clip. He's a very prominent atheist, the author of *Sapiens*, and he's you can find it anywhere, giving a tirade against anyone who thinks that human rights are real. Because if we are just evolved creatures, there can be no such thing as inherent human rights. It's theology, he says. And I always just feel sometimes atheists are very clarifying. And that's a really good example. Go and check that out, because I think it partly answers that question. We'll go over here. Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful and illuminating lecture. Could you please unpack some of the laws in the Old Testament making provision for captured female prisoners becoming wives of Israelites?
Thank you. Again, this is a massive area, and I won't do justice to it. So let me just say that the scholar, American scholar Paul Copan, has written extensively on this. He's written a book called "Is God a Moral Monster?" and various articles dealing with, you know, specific texts from mistreatment of slaves to some of the so-called genocide texts in the Old Testament to the treatment of women. And so I'll just make 2 general comments about it, if that's okay, rather than very specifically addressing detailed textual question. The first general comment would be that as a Christian, I read the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus. I read the Old Testament at all because of Jesus, right? So, and I read it with an understanding that it is a testament. That just means a covenant, and it's an era that had a beginning and has come to an end. And as I read the Bible, I read it with a view that there is both continuity and discontinuity between the Old and New Testament. So when we read as Christians the Mosaic Law, my understanding is that we're reading laws given at a particular point in time. There are different that actually come, that the time that comes to an end, and that also takes into consideration the cultural norms of the time. It's also given within time, and that's sort of seen as a theological theme called accommodation that you could explore a bit more. But it's a period of time that comes to an end, and as Christians, we are not seeking to, you know, reenact the civil laws of the Old Testament today. And we're quite glad that we don't live then. We actually live post, you know, Jesus coming, that's a position of grace. And then the second thing I think I would say is that to do justice to that legal system, you might lay them alongside the legal writings of other cultures at the time, and what you would see is overwhelmingly, massively, way more grace-filled. So those would be 2 comments I would make.
Yeah, lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for coming and speaking to us. I have a question on gender roles. Sorry, can
you say that again? I didn't hear that.
I have a question on gender roles.
Gender roles, thank you.
Yes. Yeah. So in the church I was raised in, I was taught that women and men are equal, and we are images of God, but we have different roles. So maybe like me teaching to a mixed gender audience is not my role. It's not something I can do, but it's something that men can do. And that's just what God has made us to do. And we're just different in that, but we're still equal. And then when I got to meet other people of different religions, I realized that we're not special in that argument. It seems like most religions seem to argue that they believe the genders are equal, they just have different roles. So in this situation, it seems like Christianity isn't special or unique at all. And I just had a question of how would you respond to that?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. Whenever people use the word role with connection to gender, my mind always goes to my parents' marriage. So my father is German origin and my mother is British. And one of the things that happens when people from two different cultures get married is they really disagree on gender roles. And the thing that springs to mind, the example that springs to mind is who carves the meat. In Germany, the woman's role culturally is to carve the meat. In Britain, it's the man's role to carve the meat. My question is, how much of our thinking about gender roles is actually from the scripture and how much of it is from the culture? And I think if we do a forensic deep dive, we see, I've just mentioned a woman called Priscilla who taught a man called Apollos with her husband Aquila, but she engaged in teaching him. And we're all taught in some sense by female witnesses if we believe in the core aspects of the Christian faith. It's actually pretty hard to be a Christian without being taught by a woman. You can't really know the incarnation, crucifixion, or resurrection of Jesus, so good luck. Now, obviously, I don't want to be glib about 1 Timothy 2 or 1 Corinthians 14. We've already mentioned those. And again, I want to be respectful of different interpretations of those passages. But essentially, it really does come down to those two passages and our questions about what they mean. Because elsewhere in the New Testament, we see women prophesying, women in the Old Testament even leading worship, exercising leadership as a judge, women flourishing and functioning. And so I think the last thing I would say on this is when we get into a mindset of questioning whose role is what too much, we're probably not really in the flow of the New Testament. So that's what I would offer. John, I don't know if you want to offer anything more.
No, for the sake of time, we won't. We'll just go to the penultimate question.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the usage of violence against women in the prophetic books. I'm thinking of like Ezekiel 16, where a prostitute is an analogy for Israel, and God threatens to sort of strip her of her clothes in front of the nations that she's practiced idolatry with. Some would say this sort of trivializes violence against women.
Thank you. Again, a really thoughtful question. And I suppose my understanding of that would be, obviously that's an analogy that is being used rather than something literal, it's figurative. And I think where we see that in Ezekiel, we also see male images of judgment and shame being used. So you could make an argument that actually God is treating male and female as equal in actually judging both, using different kinds of figurative analogy. But obviously one would want to be careful with that, but I think we do see both. We see male and female images of judgment, as well as male and female images of example. So, for example, in the book of Proverbs, wisdom is personified as female, which is really interesting and intriguing. So it kind of cuts both ways.
Yeah, and in Hosea, Israel is a wife that the Lord can't give up.
Yeah.
He keeps pursuing and loving.
Keeps pursuing.
The last question, thank you.
Thank you for sharing your testimony today. I want to ask some of the verses, and I want to hear your response from some of these verses. From 1 Timothy 2:12, it says, I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. And in 1 Corinthians 14:35-35, it says, women should be silent in the churches. So I wanted to ask how, as a Christian in today's culture, how would I respond to these verses that talks about female leaders within the church?
Thank you. So I think we've touched on this a little bit already this evening, but you know, in 1 Corinthians 14, where it talks about women being silent, elsewhere it talks about how women should speak when they prophesy in the church. They need to cover their hair and not wear suggestive clothes. So from 1 Corinthians, we know that Paul's expectation is women are speaking. So whatever it means, it doesn't mean they literally need to shut up in church. And so we need to be careful in how we interpret these passages. And if someone brings that to you who isn't a Bible scholar, you might want to just go back to the rest of Corinthians and show. And then remember that it's a letter being written into a specific set of pastoral issues and difficulties. And actually, that whole portion of that letter is addressing disturbances in the church. Some of the disturbances are people sort of randomly speaking in tongues. Other disturbances are a group of women in Corinth who are chattering, and it's those women who need to be quiet and learn. And if they've got a question, then ask someone else in their family when they get home. Don't make a big hullabaloo about it during the service and distract everyone. And then similarly with 1 Timothy chapter 2, the context is of female priestesses in the worship of the goddess Artemis, who were often temple prostitutes and used their sexuality to actually dominate men and refuse to have children and be child bearers. So Paul is potentially addressing a specific pastoral concern in that particular church.
Will you thank Amy? Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. First in our series, Questioning Christianity, there is a postcard which you can take, stick on the fridge, and it lets you know next month we've got a topic, Has the Church Done More Harm Than Good? By some Australian fellow. The month after that, Rebecca McLaughlin on Is Christianity Out of Date and Out of Touch? And then I apologise, in the next month, it's that Australian fellow again. Are there too many versions of Christianity to believe any one of them? Please come along. Again, thank you, Amy Orr-Ewing.